Hey everybody, KMO here, and today I recorded an interview. Actually, it was over live radio, but there was a recording made. And it was my favorite kind of interview, the kind where I am the interviewee, not the interviewer. I have done hundreds of interviews where I was the interviewer, and I've done tens of interviews where I'm the interviewee. The nice thing about being the guest is that there's no editing, there's no posting, there's no tedious chores, cleanup or anything like that. Like, I make a call, I talk to somebody who's smart and fun to talk to for a time, and then the call's over and I hang up and my part is done. It's much harder to be the host. So the host in this instance was Terry Tapp, and we were on his radio show. And he says that there will be a recorded version posted sometime soon, so I will share that link with you somehow. But when people interview me, this is an odd thing. They mostly want to talk about me and my life experience and, my interests, which that last part is the thing I most want to talk about, the subjects that I'm interested in. And so I tend these days to speed through the familiar questions, which could elicit a long story from me, but I've told that long story often enough that most of the people who are familiar with me and who have been listening to my show for years, they know those stories, so I don't really want to tell those stories again. But it's interesting because Terry is a guy, he's an artist, as am I. He is studied in philosophy, as am I, and even neuroscience. Now, I've never studied neuroscience in an academic situation, but my academic major in grad school was philosophy of mind and philosophy of science, and I was interested in neuroscience. I've read books for the general public on neuroscience. And Terry is also, like me, a former libertarian. We still have our libertarian sympathies, but neither one of us is actively stumping for the Libertarian Party or rolling out the traditional standard arguments for libertarian positions anymore. We have both found the boundaries of that particular system of thought. We have come to feel constrained by it and can't really stay within the lines anymore when it comes to being libertarian. So the interesting thing about a situation like that, Terry says he's been listening to the C-Realm podcast since like 2010, so almost a decade. So he knows my areas of interest pretty well. And so when two people who agree on a lot of things get together in a conversation, particularly a conversation where there's a live audience, the easiest thing to do to keep things dynamic, and it happens, you don't even have to plan for it, it just sort of happens, is you find the places, you survey all the areas of agreement, looking for the little places of disagreement so that you can maybe, find an interesting sort of adversarial conversation. And our conversation today was anything but adversarial, but the place where we seem to have found maybe a divergence is in climate change. I'm certainly no climate change denier, but I do think that most of the people who are making most of the noise about climate change are not climate scientists, and they're, which way they tend to lean is determined by other commitments that they have. So people who have very little information about science in general and who don't follow climate science in particular, but they are practiced in citing the specified cases. For people who want to say that climate science, or at least the alarmist version of it, is bunk, they have these practiced arguments that they heard from somebody else, and they're citing fairly specific and esoteric publications and instances of scientists making unsupportable claims. To me, that is very motivated reasoning, and it's really hard for people who aren't trained in science, and most people aren't. And I'm not formally trained in science, but I've studied philosophy of science, which sort of gives you the basis of science in passing before it gets into more esoteric waters. I just think that the really alarmist talk about what's coming in terms of climate change is yet another fantasy, a dark fantasy, which is prompted mostly by a dissatisfaction with and even contempt for, or strong aversion to, certain aspects of contemporary life. Like the zombie apocalypse, like peak oil collapse fantasies, or fantasies of a catastrophic collision with a big meteor or comet. that, we're all going to be dead from climate change in 12 years. There's no basis in rational, scientific, empirically grounded, evidentiary reasoning to think that that's the case. But for some people, it has a strong appeal because, one of the main attractions of a catastrophic collapse scenario is that the rich and powerful and privileged suffer along with everybody else. Whereas in a slow unraveling, a slow decline, or even, a continued accumulation of scientific knowledge and a continued viable economic and political and technological infrastructure, it's just, things are continuing. They're getting better in general, but for a lot of people, they're getting worse. The idea that it's all going to come down tomorrow and the rich and powerful and privileged are going to fall right along with the rest of us, there's a certain attraction to that. And I'm afraid that that's the least likely scenario on offer. The much more likely scenario is that even if things are getting shittier for most people, the richest and most privileged among us will continue to have it easy, and they will have it easy their entire lives, and they will die, in as close to comfort as you can get and still die. And justice will never be served. And that's, while for somebody like me, living in a studio apartment with a truck that I can see out the window that doesn't run, which is more of just a burden to me than it's worse than useless. To know that there are people driving around in Teslas, the expensive ones, which cost more than I would pay for a house were I to buy a house. I have no plans to buy a house anytime soon. It's easy to be grumpy about, the disparity in material prosperity, the maldistribution of wealth. At the same time, particularly thinking about the book, The Narrow Corridor, which I continue to listen to, the familiar parts again and again, the cage of norms, which is the cage of, in a stateless society. The cage of norms, it controls violence, it prevents violence from spiraling out of control, but it also puts a very strong, it lays down strictures, for individual behavior, which in some instances are really restricting, really unfair, seemingly arbitrary in a lot of cases. Things that become taboo, it may have made sense at one time for them to be taboo, but they no longer are, or the taboo has sort of metastasized into areas where it never made sense. And yet the cage of norms still, it lays a heavy hand on people's behavior, and it never respects individual liberty. And another thing that the cage of norms does is it punishes ambitious people. Somebody who would, because they have a stronger drive for, a stronger will to power, as Nietzsche would say, or, more ambition, or they're just better suited, they're more charismatic and better suited for climbing hierarchical structures, social structures. In a lot of places, the fear of what the powerful people could do should they amass a lot of power, the fear outweighs the benefit of a society where the ambitious people, their ambitions are directed into constructive ends. And if you look around our society, yes, the wealth is really not distributed very fairly. Even granted that some people, the ambitious people, the energetic people, the really focused, driven people, they create more than people like me. No question. Do they deserve 1 billion times the reward? It doesn't seem so to me, but it also seems to me that, somebody in my position has never really had it a whole lot better. Maybe in the post-World War II years, in the boom years where you really had to try to fuck up. You really had to try to fail. But if you were willing to do a modest amount of work, or even, give the appearance of working 40 hours a week, you could pretty much skate by just because, it was boom times. It's kind of boom times now, but not. The idea that the boom times require that everybody be a participant and everybody be doing pretty well by it, that's gone. We are definitely into the era of elites amassing enormous fortunes and everybody else, sinking or swimming. But the sinking is not starving to death. The sinking is just sort of fading into obscurity and, lack of status and constant stress over bills, which you can't pay, but you don't get you're not sleeping on the street, your ribs aren't showing, you know, more likely the reverse, because the cheap food is the food that's full of empty calories, and you know it prompts you to eat more of it because your body's still craving nutrition, even though you know a good portion of it's hanging over your belt. Point being, I'm filigreeing out here in too much detail. The point being that while it's obnoxious that the rich and the driven and the, you know, spectacularly ambitious have so much in comparison to everybody else, the society that grows up around them, it's pretty prosperous. And it's better to be on a low rung of a very prosperous, high-tech society than it is to be fairly high-placed in a low-tech agrarian society, where, particularly in a stateless one, or one where, you know, the cage of norms is just much stronger than the state, if there is a state. And that's just because the cage of norms there's no example of it, historically speaking, where the autonomy and freedom of action and freedom of thought and speech of the individual is enshrined. Really, the cage of norms always curtails freedom. The freedom to define yourself as you will, the freedom to pursue the work that you want, to move where you want to go, to associate with whom you want to associate, to love who you want to love. The cage of norms never enshrines the freedom of choice in those areas. It always lays a heavy controlling hand on most people. And so we're much better off in states and in large societies. But in these large societies, they develop these really tall hierarchical ladders, and the people who are driven to climb that ladder at all costs, they are rewarded. You know, they are rewarded like no other people in history have ever been rewarded, materially speaking. And it's obnoxious, but it's a sign of our success as a civilization. You know, it's also an arrow in the direction of how we can make improvements. And I'm all about that. But I'm basically just highlighting in myself the envy, the animosity, the hostility that I feel toward people who seemingly are quite shallow, seemingly are quite thoughtless, but are driven in certain respects, and you know, they reap rewards which are really unimaginable to somebody of my disposition. So, while it may sound like I'm complaining, this is more a confession than a complaint. Anyway, that's all rather convoluted, but I don't feel like doing any editing or shooting it again, so there you have it. I will talk to you again tomorrow. Actually, I'm rushing out because I want to go back and play Minecraft with my kids. Talk to you tomorrow.